Welcome to the newest episode in a Legendarium series about the greatest knights. In this episode about Sir William Wallace, we will talk about the early life and education of the man who would become a legend. While he spent some of his early years in the church, he soon left to lead his countrymen in a revolt against English rule. Though he has become part of the Scottish national psyche, relatively little is known about the early years of William Wallace. He was born sometime in the 1270s in Elderslie, a fortified settlement ruled by his father Alan Wallace. Contrary to what the movies would have you believe, Wallace did not come from a poor family in an isolated village. He lived in a large compound where several families shared living quarters, halls, forges, and stables. Smaller cottages housed farm workers. Most of the buildings were constructed with wattle and daub walls, roofed with thatch, and had tiles around the smoke holes to prevent fires. Timber, a scarce resource, served as a status symbol for Scottish aristocrats like the Wallace family. The settlement even had stone towers to protect against outlaws and wolves. Wallace was a younger son of a Scottish landowner named Alan Wallace. His Scotland was not an isolated backwater, again as the movies would have you believe, but a sophisticated kingdom that was part of an international trade network that brought high-quality goods from across Europe and even Asia. William has been described as tall and strong. Being a son of the knightly class, he had an education centered on military life, including horse riding, swordsmanship, and military tactics. However, the Wallace family hoped that William would become a monk at Paisley Abbey, which was part of the wealthy Cluniac order. The Wallace family's liege lord, the Stuart clan, would have arranged for William's entry into the order. Young William's life in the abbey would have been strictly regulated. He would have woken before dawn for early church services and received lessons in scripture, theology, and literacy. The abbey would have also included a large monastery complex that included barns, stables, and storehouses ringed by a precinct wall, complete with an elaborate sewage system that serviced all the major buildings. William Wallace's Scotland was no backwater. In time, William Wallace went to Glasgow Cathedral, where he met Bishop Robert Wishart, who taught the young scholar about Scotland's worsening political situation. In time, Bishop Wishart came to see Wallace as the man who could carry the church's banner in war against England. During Wallace's youth, Scotland was ruled by King Alexander III. However, after Alexander's death in 1286, a succession crisis erupted. King Edward of England took advantage of this crisis, installed his own candidate, the weak John Balliol, and then removed him from the throne and crushed the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar. After imprisoning the weak John Balliol, Edward Longshanks imposed himself as ruler of Scotland in 1296. King Edward needed money, and he saw Scotland as a rich kingdom that he could tax to the hilt. He also needed men for his wars in France, so he started rounding up Scottish nobles and clan leaders to fight for him on the continent. This led to suspicion among the Scots that Edward wished to see the leading men of Scotland perish in France so that he could more efficiently repress the country. During this period, William's father was killed by English troops at Loudon Hill. Bishop Wishart, one of the richest men in Scotland, provided William Wallace with the support that he needed to finance his revolt. The first known act of rebellion carried out by William Wallace took place in May 1297 in Lanark. It was one of the rich merchant towns that Edward hoped to tax. According to legend, Wallace had married a woman from Lanark named Marion Braidfoot, though if Wallace had taken clerical orders, that is unlikely. Yet Scottish folk tradition says that Wallace's rebellion began when the local sheriff, William Heselrigg, murdered Wallace's wife. Whether he wished to avenge his father, his wife, or his country, Wallace led a group of 30 men into Lanark Castle, a motte and bailey fortification made of timber and built on a 70-foot tall earthen mound. Wallace snuck into the castle with 30 men and killed the English sheriff, William Heselrigg. Supposedly, Wallace said to the sheriff before he died, "I am Wallace, die Heselrigg." He then burned the castle to ashes. Young Scots began to flock to Wallace, whose rising was one of several emerging in Scotland at the time. After Robert Wishart, his former mentor, was forced to swear allegiance to Edward Longshanks at sword point, Wallace even raided some of Wishart's properties. However, Wallace's greatest moment came at Stirling on September 11th, 1297. King Edward Longshanks sent an army. The army faced a rapidly assembled collection of clan forces led by, among others, William Wallace. English forces outnumbered the Scots by 5-1. However, the two forces were separated by a bridge, originally built by the Romans. Each pier was made of stone tiers, tapered to the top and filled with rubble for stability. The bridge itself was made of wood imported from Europe. The English expected Wallace to let them cross the bridge and form up for battle in accordance with the rules of chivalry. This became especially important for the English because the bridge was so narrow that only 2 men could cross at a time. However, Wallace was not interested in chivalry, he was interested in victory, so he allowed some of the English to cross and gather in a tight protrusion of land made by the winding river. At the blast of a horn, the Scots deployed in tight units called schiltrons, circular, hedgehog-like formations standing shoulder to shoulder with pikes facing outward in a ring of iron. Archers filled the gaps in between the schiltrons. They trapped the much larger English army between water and one side and spears on the other. The English on the other side of the river could only watch helplessly as their comrades were slaughtered. Wallace's co-commander at Stirling, Andrew Murray, was fatally wounded and died not long after the battle. Wallace then took full command of the army and led a destructive raid into northern England. He ravaged the counties of Northumberland and Cumberland. Not long after, the nobles declared Wallace to be the guardian of Scotland on behalf of King John Balliol, who remained a prisoner of King Edward Longshanks in England. Before the Battle of Stirling, England had been on the verge of a civil war between Edward and his nobles over high wartime taxes. Now they united to face the Wallace threat. Edward's army included 2,500 mounted knights and 12,500 infantry, including large numbers of Welsh longbowmen. On one occasion, Edward had to stop brutal fighting that erupted between Welsh and English fighting men. Wallace hoped to avoid a pitched battle because his own force was much smaller, totaling around 1,000 mounted knights and only 5,000 infantry. Wallace conducted hit-and-run raids against King Edward's army, while retreating steadily northwards, hoping that Edward would run out of supplies before he could force Wallace to face battle. However, just as he was running out of food, King Edward tracked down Wallace's army and forced him to give battle. On the morning of the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace formed his pikemen into 4 schiltrons. They initially withstood the English cavalry and infantry charges, but became increasingly vulnerable to Edward's Welsh longbowmen. Longbowmen, crossbowmen, and slingers rained death upon the Scots, and their schiltrons broke up. They were finally scattered by English cavalry charges, and the Scots were forced to flee into the neighboring woods for safety. The English lost 2,000 of 15,000 men, while Wallace lost 2,000 of his 6,000 men. Though Wallace was able to escape capture, he lost many of his supporters, especially among the nobility, and he had no choice but to resign the guardianship of Scotland to Robert the Bruce. As with Wallace's childhood, the details of his years after this defeat become sketchy. Most likely, the nobles of Scotland advised him to serve Scotland abroad, lobbying in Paris and Rome for help in the war against the English. Wallace spent several years outside Scotland, while King Edward Longshanks steadily gained ground and castles. For reasons we don't fully understand, Wallace returned home to begin his campaign once more sometime around 1304. The prospect of the victor of Stirling making a comeback deeply frightened King Edward. So King Edward Longshanks offered money to anyone who made Wallace a prisoner. In 1305, John de Menteith, a Scottish knight, offered Wallace hospitality and then turned him over to English soldiers near Glasgow. The English took him back to London to face trial. When Wallace was hauled before the court, he responded to the treason charge by saying, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." Indeed, Wallace was one of the few Scottish nobles who never declared loyalty to Edward Longshanks. Of course, the English court did not think that was a good answer. And if there was one thing the movies got right, it was the horrific nature of Wallace's death. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was disrobed and dragged through London at the heels of a horse upon a wooden frame. William was hung and released just before he died. The executioners cut open his abdomen, removed his bowels, and burned them on the wooden platform before him. After they castrated him, they finally chopped his head off and then placed his severed head upon London Bridge. His limbs were displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. In life, Wallace had been a controversial figure, even in Scotland, where he had many detractors because of his crushing defeat and also because of his hardline position against King Edward, which some viewed as counterproductive. But in death, he became a nationalist martyr and hero, who inspired thousands to take up arms against the English. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.